Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the blazing Virginia sun, sweat dripping down her face as drill instructor Phillips screamed at the recruit formation. The Marine Corps Officer Candidate School was supposed to be the toughest military training program in the world, and after 12 weeks of hell, Sarah had come to believe every word of that reputation. Martinez, front and center, Phillips bellowed, his voice carrying across the parade deck like thunder. Sarah's heart sank. She knew what was coming. For 3 months, she had endured everything the Marine Corps could throw at her. Physical training that pushed her body beyond its limits. Academic challenges that tested her mind. Leadership scenarios designed to break her spirit. But, through it all, one thing had remained constant. The barely concealed hostility of her instructors. She jogged to the front of the formation, her boots echoing against the concrete. Phillips waited with his arms crossed, his face twisted in disgust. Behind him stood Captain Morrison, the company commander, and several other staff members. None of them looked pleased. "Candidate Martinez," Phillips began, his voice dripping with contempt. "In my 22 years in the Corps, I have never seen such a pathetic excuse for a Marine officer candidate." Sarah kept her eyes straight ahead, fighting the urge to respond. She had learned early in training that arguing with instructors only made things worse. But, inside, her anger burned like fire. She had outscored most of her male counterparts on every physical fitness test. Her academic scores were among the highest in the company. Her leadership evaluations were consistently excellent. Yet somehow, nothing she did was ever good enough. "Your performance during yesterday's combat exercise was unacceptable." Captain Morrison stepped forward, his voice cold and professional. "Your squad failed to secure the objective within the time limit." Sarah's jaw tightened. The combat exercise had been a setup from the beginning. While other squads received clear intelligence briefings and proper equipment, her team had been given outdated maps and faulty radios. When she had improvised solutions and led her squad to complete the mission using alternative tactics, the instructors had moved the goalposts and declared her methods unacceptable. Furthermore, Morrison continued, "Your attitude toward military discipline has been consistently problematic. Multiple instructors have reported incidents of insubordination and failure to respect the chain of command." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Insubordination? She had followed every order to the letter, no matter how unreasonable or pointless. The only thing she had been guilty of was asking questions when orders seemed tactically unsound, and offering alternative suggestions when she saw better ways to accomplish missions. In any other context, that would be called initiative and critical thinking. Here, it was labeled as defiance. Phillips stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. "The truth is, Martinez, you don't belong here. You never did. This is a man's world, and you're just a little girl playing dress-up in a uniform." The words stung, but Sarah had heard worse over the past 3 months. What hurt more was the knowledge that despite all her efforts, despite all her sacrifices, they had already made up their minds about her. She wasn't being judged on her performance or potential. She was being judged on their prejudices. Effective immediately, Morrison announced, "Candidate Martinez is dismissed from Officer Candidate School for failure to meet Marine Corps standards. You will pack your belongings and report to administration for out-processing. Your military career is over before it began." The formation of other candidates watched in stunned silence as Sarah was marched away from the parade deck. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed relieved that it wasn't them facing dismissal. A few appeared satisfied, as if her failure confirmed their belief that women didn't belong in combat roles. As Sarah walked toward the barracks to collect her things, her mind raced with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and determination. She had dreamed of becoming a Marine officer since childhood, inspired by stories of Marines who fought against impossible odds and never gave up. Now that dream was dead, killed not by enemy fire or impossible circumstances, but by the very institution she had wanted to serve. In her room, Sarah methodically packed her civilian clothes and personal items. Her uniforms would stay behind, along with 3 months of blood, sweat, and tears. As she folded her few belongings into a duffel bag, she reflected on how she had ended up here. Growing up in East Los Angeles, Sarah had seen plenty of young people fall into gangs, drugs, and violence. Her father, a police officer, had been killed in the line of duty when she was 16. Her mother worked 2 jobs to support Sarah and her younger brother. College seemed impossible until a Marine recruiter visited her high school and talked about opportunities for leadership, education, and service. Sarah had enlisted in the Marines immediately after graduation, serving 4 years as an infantryman. She had deployed to Afghanistan twice, earning decorations for valor and leadership under fire. Her squad leader and company commander had both encouraged her to apply for officer candidate school, praising her tactical knowledge, physical fitness, and ability to lead Marines in combat. But none of that mattered now. The Marine Corps had spoken, and their message was clear. She wasn't welcome. As Sarah zipped up her duffel bag, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room. The door opened, and candidate James Wilson stepped inside. Wilson was one of the few candidates who had treated her with respect throughout training. A former Army sergeant, he understood what it was like to work twice as hard for half the recognition. "Sarah, I'm sorry," Wilson said quietly, closing the door behind him. "What they did to you was wrong. Everyone knows it." Sarah looked up from her packing. "Knowing it and doing something about it are 2 different things, James. I tried to speak up during the debrief yesterday. I told them your tactics were solid and that the mission failure wasn't your fault. Morrison told me to mind my own business." "I appreciate that," Sarah said, shouldering her duffel bag. "But it wouldn't have mattered anyway. They made their decision about me the day I arrived." Wilson nodded grimly. "What are you going to do now?" Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the parade deck where she had just been humiliated. Other companies were conducting drill practice, their synchronized movements creating patterns of precision and discipline. For 3 months, she had been part of that world. Now she was an outsider again. "I don't know," she admitted. "My contract with the Corps is up in 6 months. I could extend and try to become an NCO, but after this..." She shrugged. "Maybe it's time to try something different." "You're one of the best Marines I've ever served with," Wilson said firmly. "Don't let these bastards convince you otherwise." After Wilson left, Sarah finished her packing and made her way to the administration building for out-processing. The paperwork was routine but humiliating. Question after question about her failure to complete training, as if she were some kind of disciplinary problem rather than a decorated combat veteran. The administrative clerk, a young lance corporal who couldn't have been more than 19, spoke to her with the kind of condescending tone usually reserved for troublemakers and malcontents. "Ma'am, you'll need to sign here acknowledging that your dismissal from officer candidate school is based on failure to meet Marine Corps standards," the clerk said, sliding a form across the desk. Sarah read the document carefully. It was filled with vague language about leadership deficiencies and inability to adapt to military discipline. Nothing about her actual performance or achievements. Nothing about the obvious bias she had faced from day one. "What if I refuse to sign?" Sarah asked. The clerk looked surprised. "Ma'am, you have to sign. It's part of the out-processing procedure. I'm asking what happens if I don't." The clerk stammered for a moment, then called for his supervisor. A staff sergeant emerged from a back office, looking annoyed at the interruption. "What's the problem here?" the staff sergeant asked. "The candidate is refusing to sign her dismissal paperwork," the clerk explained. The staff sergeant looked at Sarah with obvious irritation. "Ma'am, you need to sign those documents so we can complete your out-processing." "I want to speak with someone about filing a formal complaint," Sarah said calmly. "I believe my dismissal was based on gender discrimination rather than actual performance deficiencies." The staff sergeant's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I strongly advise you to sign those papers and move on with your life. Making trouble isn't going to help your situation." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Sergeant, I've been making trouble for the enemy for 4 years. A little more won't hurt me." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of helicopters approaching the base. Through the office windows, Sarah could see 2 black aircraft flying low and fast toward the main parade deck. The distinctive sound of their rotors was unmistakable. These weren't Marine helicopters. The staff sergeant frowned and stepped to the window. "What the hell are those birds doing here?" Sarah recognized the aircraft immediately. MH-60 Black Hawks, the kind used by Special Operations Forces. As the helicopters touched down on the parade deck, she could see figures in combat gear emerging from the aircraft. Their equipment and bearing marked them as elite operators, but their specific unit wasn't immediately clear. "Looks like we've got visitors," the clerk observed, his previous authority replaced by curiosity. The staff sergeant grabbed his radio and called the command center. After a brief conversation, he turned back to Sarah with a confused expression. "Ma'am, you're going to have to wait on that paperwork. Apparently, someone wants to see you." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea why special operations helicopters would be landing at officer candidate school, or why anyone aboard them would want to speak with a dismissed candidate. Her first thought was that something had happened to her family, but military notification procedures didn't typically involve Black Hawks and special operators. "Who wants to see me?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," the staff sergeant replied. "But whoever they are, they've got enough juice to shut down the entire base for their visit." Through the window, Sarah watched as the mysterious operators formed a perimeter around their helicopters. Their movements were precise and professional, the kind of coordination that only came from years of training and combat experience. Whatever brought them here, it was serious enough to warrant significant security measures. A few minutes later, Captain Morrison appeared in the administrative office, his face flushed with exertion and confusion. "Martinez," he said breathlessly, "you need to come with me." "Now." "Sir, I'm in the middle of out-processing," Sarah replied. "Forget the paperwork," Morrison snapped. "We've got some very important people who want to speak with you, and they're not the kind of people you keep waiting." As Sarah followed Morrison out of the building, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of twist her already surreal day was about to take. The parade deck was now completely cleared of regular training activities, with the two Black Hawks sitting like predatory birds in the center of the open space. Standing near the aircraft was a small group of men in military uniforms she didn't immediately recognize. Their bearing and equipment marked them as special operations, but their specific unit remained unclear. What was obvious was their authority. Even senior Marine officers were treating them with deference and respect. As she approached the group, one of the men stepped forward. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years in combat zones. His uniform bore no visible rank insignia, but his presence commanded immediate attention. "Sarah Martinez?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, coming to attention. The man studied her for a moment, his eyes taking in details that most people would miss. Sarah had the distinct feeling she was being evaluated by someone who knew exactly what to look for. "I'm Commander Thompson," he said finally. "I understand you've had some difficulties with your training here." Sarah glanced at Captain Morrison, who was standing nearby with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. Whatever was happening, it was clearly above his pay grade. "Sir, I was dismissed from officer candidate school this morning," Sarah said carefully. Thompson nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "Tell me, Martinez, what's your assessment of your performance here?" The question caught Sarah off guard. For 3 months, no instructor had asked for her opinion on anything. Now a complete stranger was asking her to evaluate herself in front of the same officers who had just dismissed her. "Sir, I believe I met or exceeded all stated standards for physical fitness, academics, and leadership," Sarah said honestly. "I completed every assigned task and followed all orders as given." "And yet you were dismissed," Thompson observed. "Yes, sir." "Why do you think that happened?" Sarah hesitated. Honesty could get her in even more trouble than she was already in, but something about Thompson's demeanor suggested that diplomatic answers wouldn't serve her well. "Sir, I believe there were factors beyond my performance that influenced the decision," she said carefully. Thompson's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a slight nod of approval. He turned to Morrison, who had been listening to the exchange with growing discomfort. "Captain, I'd like to review candidate Martinez's complete training records," Thompson said. "Sir, that information is classified and restricted to Marine Corps personnel," Morrison replied. Thompson reached into his pocket and produced a folded document. He handed it to Morrison, who read it quickly, his face growing pale. "Of course, sir," Morrison said hastily. "I'll have those records ready for you immediately." As Morrison hurried away, Thompson turned back to Sarah. "Martinez, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Are you interested in serving your country in a different capacity? Sarah felt her heart rate increase. The question was loaded with implications she didn't fully understand, but the tone suggested this was about much more than administrative paperwork. Sir, I've always been committed to serving my country, she replied. That's not what I asked, Thompson said quietly. I asked if you're interested in serving in a different capacity, one that might better utilize your particular skills and experience. Before Sarah could respond, another figure approached from the direction of the helicopters. This man was shorter than Thompson, but carried himself with the same quiet authority. As he got closer, Sarah could see that he wore the distinctive insignia of a Navy SEAL. The implications of that observation hit her like a thunderbolt. Navy SEALs didn't typically visit Marine training facilities unless something very specific was happening. And they certainly didn't land on parade decks to have casual conversations with dismissed officer candidates. Thompson glanced at his companion, then back at Sarah. Martinez, your military record makes for interesting reading. 2 combat deployments, 3 decorations for valor, expert marksman ratings with multiple weapon systems, and consistent top rankings in leadership evaluations from your unit commanders. Sir, those achievements apparently weren't sufficient for officer candidate school, Sarah replied. No, Thompson agreed. But they might be exactly what we're looking for in a different program. The SEAL stepped forward and extended his hand. Sarah, I'm Master Chief Petty Officer Williams. I've been following your career for some time. Sarah shook his hand, her mind racing to understand how a Navy SEAL would even know she existed, much less be following her career. Master Chief, I'm not sure I understand, Sarah said. Williams smiled, and for the first time since her dismissal, Sarah saw something other than hostility or indifference in a superior's expression. Sarah stared at Master Chief Williams in stunned silence. The question seemed impossible, like something from a dream or a movie rather than reality. Women weren't allowed in the Navy SEALs. Everyone knew that. It was one of the last remaining barriers in military special operations, a line that had never been crossed. Master Chief, I think there might be some misunderstanding, Sarah said carefully. Women aren't eligible for SEAL training. Williams exchanged a look with Commander Thompson. That changed 6 months ago, Thompson said quietly. The program is still classified, but the Department of Defense has authorized a pilot program to evaluate female candidates for special operations roles previously closed to women. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. 6 months ago, she had been serving in Afghanistan, completely unaware that the military was quietly opening doors that had been closed for decades. Now, on the worst day of her military career, those same doors were being offered to her. Sir, why me? Sarah asked. There must be thousands of female service members who would be interested in this opportunity. Actually, there aren't, Williams replied. The selection criteria are very specific. We need candidates with proven combat experience, exceptional physical fitness, demonstrated leadership under pressure, and the psychological resilience to handle SEAL training. The pool of women who meet all those requirements is surprisingly small. Thompson consulted a tablet he had been carrying. Your record shows you led a squad through 18 months of combat operations without losing a single Marine. You've been decorated for actions under fire on 3 separate occasions. Your fitness scores are in the top 5% of all Marines, male or female. And your psychological evaluations indicate exceptional stress tolerance and decision-making ability under pressure. But I just got kicked out of officer candidate school, Sarah pointed out. For reasons that have nothing to do with your actual capabilities, Williams said bluntly. We've been watching you throughout your time here. We know exactly why you were dismissed, and we know it wasn't because of any deficiencies on your part. The implications of that statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. You've been watching me? For how long? Since you were recommended for this program 8 months ago, Thompson explained. Your company commander in Afghanistan submitted your name for consideration after your performance during Operation Dragon Strike. Sarah remembered that operation vividly. Her squad had been tasked with securing a village that intel suggested was being used as a Taliban staging area. What they found instead was a trap, more than 50 enemy fighters in prepared positions, with her 12 Marines caught in a deadly crossfire. Most squad leaders would have called for immediate extraction or massive fire support. Sarah had done something different. She had split her squad into 3 elements, used the terrain to mask their movements, and executed a complex flanking maneuver that neutralized the enemy force while minimizing civilian casualties. The operation had taken 6 hours of careful maneuvering and precise shooting, but when it was over, every Marine in her squad was alive and walking. "Sir, that was just doing my job," Sarah said. "No," Williams corrected. "That was leadership and tactical brilliance under extreme pressure. The kind of decision-making we need in special operations." Captain Morrison returned with a thick folder of documents, which he handed to Thompson with obvious reluctance. Thompson flipped through the papers quickly, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is exactly what I expected to find," Thompson said, closing the folder. He looked at Morrison with obvious disgust. "Captain, your training cadre's evaluation of candidate Martinez bears no resemblance to her actual performance metrics. In fact, it appears to be a deliberate misrepresentation designed to justify a predetermined conclusion." Morrison's face flushed red. "Sir, I resent the implication that my instructors are anything less than professional." "I'm not implying anything," Thompson replied coldly. "I'm stating a fact. This candidate has been subjected to systematic harassment and discriminatory treatment from the moment she arrived at your facility." "Sir, that's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation," Thompson cut him off. "One that will be investigated by the appropriate authorities. In the meantime, candidate Martinez is no longer your concern." Sarah watched the exchange with growing amazement. For 3 months, she had felt completely powerless against the institutional bias she faced. Now, complete strangers were defending her and holding her tormentors accountable. Williams stepped closer to Sarah, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. SEAL training is the hardest military program in the world. The physical demands are extreme, the mental pressure is unrelenting, and the failure rate is over 70%. Most candidates who start the program don't finish." "Master Chief, I understand the reputation of SEAL training," Sarah replied. "I don't think you do," Williams continued. BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL training, is designed to break people. It finds your physical and psychological limits and pushes you far beyond them. It will test everything you think you know about yourself. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "With respect, Master Chief, I've been tested before." Williams nodded approvingly. "Yes, you have, but not like this. In BUD/S, failure is expected. Quitting is normal. The instructors aren't trying to train you. They're trying to eliminate you. Only the absolutely most determined candidates survive. And you think I might be one of them?" "I think you have the potential," Williams said. "But potential isn't enough. You'll need absolute commitment, physical and mental toughness beyond anything you've experienced, and the ability to perform when everything inside you is screaming to quit." Thompson joined their conversation. "Sarah, we need to be completely honest with you about what you're considering. This pilot program is highly controversial. There are people throughout the military who don't want it to succeed. Some of them will do everything they can to ensure female candidates fail. So, I'd be facing the same kind of discrimination I experienced here?" Sarah asked. "Possibly worse," Thompson admitted. "But there's a crucial difference. In SEAL training, performance is everything. If you can do the job, if you can meet the standards, if you can prove yourself under pressure, none of the politics matter. The teams need operators who can perform when lives are on the line. Everything else is secondary." Sarah considered this. The idea of facing even more intense hostility than she had experienced at officer candidate school was daunting. But the possibility of serving in a unit where competence mattered more than prejudice was incredibly appealing. "What would be expected of me?" Sarah asked. "The same thing expected of every SEAL candidate," Williams replied. 24 weeks of BUD/S training in Coronado, California. If you pass that, you'll go on to advanced individual training, specialized schools, and eventually assignment to an operational team. And if I fail, you complete your Marine Corps contract and move on with your life, Thompson said. "But, Sarah, I need you to understand something. You wouldn't just be training to become a SEAL. You'd be proving that women can succeed in special operations roles. Your performance would influence policy decisions that affect thousands of female service members for decades to come." The weight of that responsibility was staggering. Sarah had always been competitive and ambitious, but she had never imagined carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire gender into combat. "Sir, that seems like a lot of pressure to put on one person," Sarah said. "It is," Thompson agreed, "which is why we need someone with your particular combination of skills, experience, and psychological makeup. This isn't just about individual achievement. It's about changing the military forever." Williams pulled out his phone and checked the time. "Sarah, we need a decision today. The next BUD/S class starts in 2 weeks. If you're interested, we need to begin the transfer paperwork immediately." Sarah looked around the parade deck, where she had been humiliated just hours earlier. The Marine officers were still watching from a distance, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Some clearly resented the intervention of outsiders in their business. Others seemed simply confused by the unprecedented situation. "Can I ask you something, Master Chief?" Sarah said. "Of course. Do you really think I can make it through SEAL training?" "Honestly." Williams studied her for a long moment before answering. "Sarah, I've been a SEAL for 15 years. I've seen hundreds of candidates come and go. Most of them fail not because they lack physical ability, but because they lack the mental toughness to push through when everything hurts and nothing makes sense." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Based on what I've seen of your record, based on how you've handled the adversity here, and based on my gut instinct after 30 minutes of conversation, I think you have as good a chance as anyone who's ever started the program. But do you think I can finish it?" "I think you'll find out," Williams replied with a slight smile. "And I think that's exactly the kind of person we need." Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. 3 hours ago, her military career had seemed over. Now she was being offered the chance to attempt something that had never been done before, to push the boundaries of what was possible, and to potentially change history. But beneath the excitement and possibility, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had defined her entire military career. She had always been fighting not just for herself, but for everyone who looked like her, everyone who faced the same barriers and prejudices. This would be the ultimate test of that burden. "If I say yes," Sarah said slowly, "what happens next?" Thompson consulted his tablet again. "We fly you to San Diego tonight. You'll have 48 hours to complete administrative processing and medical screening. Then, you'll begin BUD/S with Class 347. And if I say no, you finish your Marine Corps contract, and we look for other candidates," Williams said simply. "No judgment, no pressure. This is a completely voluntary program." Sarah took a deep breath and looked one more time at the Marine officers who had dismissed her. Captain Morrison was still holding her incomplete paperwork, uncertain whether she was still his responsibility or not. Drill Instructor Phillips stood with his arms crossed, his expression suggesting he hoped she would disappear entirely. For 3 months, these men had told her she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong, that she should give up her dreams and accept her limitations. Now she had the chance to prove them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. But, more than revenge or vindication, Sarah felt a deeper motivation. She thought about all the young women who might follow in her footsteps, who might face the same barriers and prejudices. If she succeeded, their path would be easier. If she failed, their opportunities might disappear entirely. "Master Chief," Sarah said finally, "when do we leave?" Williams broke into a genuine smile. "That's what I was hoping to hear. We'll depart in 30 minutes. Thompson stepped forward and offered his hand. "Sarah, I want you to know that regardless of what happens in training, you're already making history just by accepting this challenge." As Sarah shook his hand, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that was unlike anything she had experienced before. She was about to embark on the most difficult challenge of her life, with odds stacked against her and the weight of expectations that no SEAL candidate had ever carried. But, for the first time in months, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than running away from failure. The Marines had rejected her, but the Navy was offering her the chance to become something extraordinary. Williams gestured toward one of the Black Hawks. "Sarah, grab your gear, and let's go change your life." As Sarah walked toward her new future, she could hear the murmur of conversations behind her. The Marine instructors were undoubtedly trying to process what had just happened, struggling to understand how a dismissed candidate had suddenly, become the center of a classified military program. Captain Morrison called out as she reached the helicopter. Martinez, you still need to sign your out-processing paperwork. Sarah turned back and smiled. Captain, I think my paperwork just became someone else's problem. She climbed into the Black Hawk and strapped herself into a seat next to Williams. The crew chief signaled the pilots, and the aircraft's engines began spooling up. Through the window, Sarah could see the Marine officers standing in a confused group on the parade deck, still trying to understand what had just happened. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before Sarah as she stood in formation with 47 other SEAL candidates on the beach at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The California sun was barely visible through the morning fog, casting everything in a gray, otherworldly light that seemed appropriate for what was about to begin. Gentlemen, Instructor Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying easily over the sound of waves crashing behind them. Welcome to BUD/S. For the next 6 months, this beach, this base, and this program will be your entire universe. Rodriguez was a compact man with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in special operations. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing professional, but his eyes held the predatory gleam of someone who genuinely enjoyed the process of breaking people down to their core components. Some of you think you know what you've signed up for, Rodriguez continued, walking slowly along the formation. You've heard stories, watched movies, read books. Let me save you some time and disappointment. Everything you think you know is wrong. Sarah kept her eyes locked straight ahead, acutely aware that she was the only woman in the formation. During the 2 days of administrative processing before training began, she had endured countless stares, whispered comments, and barely concealed skepticism from staff and candidates alike. Some reactions had been hostile, others merely curious, but none had been indifferent. The Navy had made minimal accommodations for her presence. She had been assigned private quarters rather than sharing barracks space with male candidates. But, beyond that, she was expected to meet exactly the same standards as everyone else. The message was clear: equality meant equal treatment, equal expectations, and equal consequences for failure. BUD/S has 3 phases, Rodriguez explained. First phase is 8 weeks of conditioning. You will discover muscles you didn't know you had, and then you will learn what it feels like when they fail you completely. Second phase is 8 weeks of diving and underwater operations. You will learn to function in an environment where a single mistake means death. Third phase is 8 weeks of land warfare. You will learn to fight, to think, and to lead under conditions designed to overwhelm your ability to function. He paused in front of Sarah, his eyes meeting hers for a long moment. She could see him evaluating her, looking for signs of weakness or doubt. Sarah met his gaze steadily, her expression neutral but determined. But before we get to any of that, Rodriguez continued, moving on down the line, you have to survive Hell Week. 5.5 days of continuous training with a total of 4 hours of sleep. It starts in 3 weeks, and it will eliminate most of you. Sarah had heard about Hell Week from every SEAL she had ever met. It was the defining experience of BUD/S training, the ultimate test that separated those who wanted to be SEALs from those who were willing to endure anything to become SEALs. The statistics were sobering. Roughly 70% of candidates who made it to Hell Week would ring the bell and quit before it was over. Behind me, Rodriguez said, gesturing toward a brass bell mounted on a wooden post, is your way out. Ring it 3 times, and your suffering ends immediately. You'll be processed out of the program and transferred to another Navy assignment. No shame, no judgment, just recognition that SEAL training isn't for everyone. The bell gleamed in the pale morning light, polished to a mirror finish by the hands of countless quitters. Sarah had been staring at it for 10 minutes, and already it seemed to exert a strange psychological pull. It represented the easy way out, the end of pain and humiliation and impossible demands. For the next 24 weeks, Rodriguez continued, that bell will be the most important object in your universe. It will call to you when you're so tired you can't remember your own name. It will whisper to you when you're so cold you can't feel your extremities. It will sing to you when you're so exhausted that death seems preferable to taking another step. He walked back to the center of the formation, his expression serious. Some of you are here because you want to serve your country. Some are here for adventure or glory or personal challenge. Some are here because you think being a SEAL will make you special. Sarah felt his words hit uncomfortably close to home. Her motivations were complex, mixing genuine desire to serve with personal ambition and the weight of representing all women in combat roles. She wasn't entirely sure herself why she was standing on this beach, preparing to endure months of deliberate torture. Let me tell you what being a SEAL actually means, Rodriguez said. It means being part of a brotherhood forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence. It means being willing to die for the man next to you, and knowing he's willing to die for you. It means accepting that your individual desires, your comfort, your very sense of self are subordinate to the mission and the team. He paused, scanning the formation once more. Some of you will discover that you don't have what it takes. Some will quit today, some will quit next week, and some will make it all the way to Hell Week before they realize they've reached their limit. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The words were directed at the entire formation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were particularly meant for her. As the only woman present, she represented an unknown quantity, an experiment whose outcome would influence military policy for generations. But for those of you who do have what it takes, Rodriguez continued, for those who are willing to sacrifice everything to earn the right to be called a SEAL, this program will transform you into something you never imagined possible. You will discover reserves of strength, courage, and determination that you didn't know existed. The instructor gestured toward a group of senior SEAL operators standing nearby. These men had completed BUD/S, served in operational teams, and returned to train the next generation. Their presence was both inspiring and intimidating. They represented what success looked like, but also served as a constant reminder of how far candidates had to go. Your instructors are all Fleet SEALs with multiple combat deployments, Rodriguez explained. They have earned the right to push you beyond what you think is possible because they have been pushed beyond what they thought was possible. They will demand excellence not because they enjoy making you suffer, but because your teammates' lives will depend on your ability to perform under pressure. Sarah understood the logic, but that didn't make the prospect any less daunting. She had thought Marine Corps training was intense, but BUD/S was designed to be something entirely different. The Marines had wanted to build competent infantry soldiers. The SEALs wanted to create operators who could function effectively in any environment under any conditions. Before we begin the fun, Rodriguez announced with a predatory smile, you need to understand the rules. First rule, everything you do reflects on every other member of your class. If one person fails to meet standards, everyone suffers the consequences. You succeed together or fail together. This was standard military training psychology, but Sarah knew it would create particular challenges for her. If she struggled or failed, it wouldn't just reflect on her individual abilities. It would validate every stereotype about women in combat roles. The other candidates would resent her not just for affecting their training, but for representing a policy change they might not support. Second rule, Rodriguez continued, there are no excuses. Equipment failure, weather conditions, personal problems, physical limitations, none of it matters. Mission accomplishment is the only acceptable outcome. Sarah had lived by similar principles throughout her Marine Corps career, but she sensed that SEAL standards would be even more demanding. In infantry units, there was usually some recognition of human limitations and circumstances beyond individual control. Here, it seemed like such considerations were viewed as weakness. Third rule, your instructors are always right, even when they're wrong. Your job is to follow orders quickly and efficiently, not to debate their wisdom or fairness. This rule would be particularly challenging for Sarah. Throughout her military career, she had been praised for her ability to think critically and offer alternative perspectives. In SEAL training, such initiative would apparently be viewed as insubordination. And, finally, Rodriguez concluded, the only easy day was yesterday. Every day will be harder than the one before. Every evolution will push you further than you've ever been pushed. Every moment will test your commitment to becoming a SEAL. He nodded to the other instructors, who began moving toward the candidates with obvious enthusiasm. Gentlemen, your first evolution is a simple beach run. For miles along the surf line, staying together as a class. Should take about 30 minutes for motivated individuals. The candidates began shedding their outer clothing, revealing the physical conditioning they had spent months developing in preparation for BUD/S. Sarah was impressed by the general fitness level of her classmates, but also confident in her own preparation. She had been running, swimming, and doing calisthenics for hours every day since accepting the SEAL challenge. Wait, Rodriguez called out as the candidates prepared to begin running. I forgot to mention one small detail. You'll be wearing your boots. Sarah looked down at her heavy combat boots, then at the soft sand of the beach. Running 4 miles in boots through sand would be exponentially more difficult than running the same distance in athletic shoes on solid ground. It was the first indication of how SEAL training would take familiar challenges and make them infinitely more demanding. And you'll be carrying your buddy, Rodriguez added with a smile. The candidates looked around in confusion until the instructors began pairing them off. Sarah found herself matched with a tall, lean candidate named Peterson who looked like he might have been a distance runner in civilian life. Ma'am, Peterson said quietly, I'm not sure how this is supposed to work. Sarah understood his concern. Military training had traditionally separated male and female candidates for physical evolutions to account for physiological differences. But SEAL training was apparently going to ignore such considerations entirely. We'll figure it out, Sarah replied. I'll carry you for the first half. You carry me for the second half. Peterson looked skeptical, but nodded. Roger that. As the evolution began, Sarah quickly discovered that carrying another person through sand while wearing combat boots was almost impossibly difficult. Within the first quarter mile, her legs were burning and her breathing was labored. The uneven weight distribution made balance treacherous, and the soft sand provided no stable footing. But around her, every other candidate was struggling with the same challenges. Some were clearly stronger than others, but no one was finding the evolution easy. Sarah began to understand that SEAL training wasn't designed to favor any particular body type or fitness background. It was designed to push everyone beyond their individual limits. By the halfway point, several candidates had fallen behind the main group. The instructors were moving among them like predators, shouting encouragement that sounded more like threats. Sarah and Peterson had managed to maintain position in the middle of the pack, but both were exhausted. Switch, Sarah gasped, and Peterson took over the carrying duties. To his credit, Peterson made no complaints about carrying a female candidate. He simply adjusted his grip, found his rhythm, and began moving down the beach. Sarah was grateful for his professionalism, but also aware that their partnership would be scrutinized by instructors and classmates alike. The final mile was a nightmare of burning muscles, labored breathing, and increasing desperation. Several candidates had begun walking, accepting the inevitable punishment rather than continuing to run. The instructors were screaming at everyone, demanding better performance, and questioning their motivation for attempting SEAL training. When the class finally reached the finish point, they were immediately ordered into the surf. The cold Pacific water was a shock to overheated bodies, but also a relief from the burning sensation in overtaxed muscles. Sarah found herself standing waist-deep in the ocean, shivering and gasping alongside 47 men who looked as miserable as she felt. Congratulations, Rodriguez announced from the dry beach. You've completed your first BUD/S evolution. How do you feel? The question was clearly rhetorical, but several candidates responded with weak cheers or expressions of satisfaction. Sarah remained silent, conserving energy and trying to process what had just happened. Good, Rodriguez continued, because that was the easy one. Tomorrow we'll see how you handle something challenging. As the class stumbled out of the surf and began preparing for the next evolution, Sarah caught sight of several officers observing from a distance. She recognized Commander Thompson among them, along with several other senior personnel she didn't know. Their presence reminded her that her performance was being watched and evaluated by people far above the level of BUD/S instructors. Peterson approached her as they gathered their equipment. Martinez, you did good out there. I wasn't sure what to expect. Thanks, Sarah replied. You too. This is going to be a long 6 months, Peterson observed. Sarah looked around at their exhausted classmates. Then, back at the brass bell that seemed to gleam more brightly in the afternoon sun. 3 candidates had already rung out during the first evolution, recognizing that SEAL training was beyond their capabilities. The brass bell seemed to mock Sarah as she stood in the pre-dawn darkness with the 22 remaining members of Class 347. 3 weeks of punishing training had eliminated more than half of the original candidates, and Hell Week hadn't even started yet. The elimination rate was exactly what the instructors had predicted, but seeing so many determined people simply disappear was sobering. Ladies and gentlemen, Instructor Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the night air like a blade. It's time to find out what you're really made of. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate despite her best efforts to remain calm. Hell Week was the legendary crucible that defined SEAL training, 5.5 days of continuous operations with a total of 4 hours of sleep. Everything she had endured for the past 3 weeks had been preparation for this moment. For the next 132 hours, Rodriguez continued, you will discover things about yourselves that you never knew existed. You will find your physical limits, then push far beyond them. You will hallucinate from exhaustion, make decisions with a brain that barely functions, and perform complex tasks when your body is screaming for rest. The instructor gestured toward the ocean, where Sarah could see the dark shapes of inflatable boats waiting in the surf. Those boats would become intimate companions over the next 6 days, carried everywhere they went, used for every water evolution, and transformed from simple equipment into symbols of shared suffering. Some of you will quit in the first 12 hours, Rodriguez said matter-of-factly. Some will make it 2 or 3 days before you reach your breaking point. A very few might actually survive until Sunday morning. Those people will discover what it truly means to be a SEAL. Sarah glanced around at her remaining classmates. Peterson was still there, along with Williams, Chun, Rodriguez, no relation to the instructor, and 18 other candidates who had proven themselves capable of enduring impossible demands. They had survived log PT, surf torture, 4-mile timed runs in boots, and endless hours of calisthenics designed to push human bodies beyond their design limits. But Hell Week would be different. It wasn't just about physical fitness or mental toughness. It was about the ability to continue functioning when every rational thought screamed for surrender. It was about finding strength in weakness and moving forward when forward movement seemed impossible. Your first evolution is a night swim, the instructor announced. 2 miles in the ocean, in full gear, staying together as a class. Should be relaxing after all the hard work you've been doing. The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, but Sarah had learned not to react to instructor comments. Everything they said was designed to provoke responses that would reveal weaknesses or vulnerabilities. The key was to remain focused on the task at hand and ignore the psychological warfare. As the class entered the frigid Pacific, Sarah felt the familiar shock of cold water penetrating her wetsuit. Night swimming in the ocean was inherently dangerous. Visibility was almost zero. Currents could separate swimmers from the group, and exhaustion made even simple tasks monumentally difficult. But worse than the physical challenges was the psychological impact of swimming in complete darkness. The ocean seemed infinite and hostile, a vast emptiness that could swallow swimmers without trace. Sarah had to fight the irrational fear that she was swimming away from shore rather than parallel to it, that the group was disappearing into the night without her. The 2-mile swim took more than 2 hours, with frequent stops to regroup and ensure no one had fallen behind. By the time they reached the finish point, hypothermia was becoming a serious concern. Several candidates were showing signs of advanced cold exposure, their movements sluggish and coordination impaired. Outstanding, Rodriguez announced as the class stumbled onto the beach. Now grab your boats and prepare for a little land navigation exercise. The boats weighed 180 pounds empty, more than 200 pounds with equipment. Carrying them required 6-person teams working in perfect coordination, with the weight distributed across their heads and shoulders. Sarah found herself in a boat crew with Peterson, Williams, Chun, Rodriguez, and a massive candidate named Thompson who had played football at the Naval Academy. The land navigation exercise turned out to be a 12-mile trek across the base, carrying the boats over their heads. Within the first mile, Sarah's neck and shoulders were screaming in protest. The weight seemed to increase with every step, and the uneven terrain made balance treacherous. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological pressure of being the only woman in her boat crew. Every time she stumbled or adjusted her grip, she could feel her teammates evaluating her contribution. If the crew fell behind or failed to meet time standards, she would inevitably be blamed for the group's shortcomings. "Keep it together, Martinez," Peterson whispered during one of their brief rest periods. "You're doing fine." Sarah appreciated the encouragement, but she knew that fine wouldn't be good enough. She needed to be exceptional, to prove that women could not only survive SEAL training but excel in it. Anything less would validate every stereotype and prejudice she had faced throughout her military career. The land navigation exercise concluded just as the sun was rising, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But by this point, Class 347 had been awake and training for nearly 24 hours, and their exhaustion was beginning to show in obvious ways. "Time for breakfast," Rodriguez announced cheerfully. "But first, let's see how you handle a little surf passage." Surf passage was one of the most feared evolutions in BUD/S training. Candidates had to paddle their boats through heavy surf, navigate around buoys in the ocean, and return to shore without flipping or losing crew members. In calm conditions, it was challenging but manageable. In the 6-foot swells they faced that morning, it bordered on impossible. Sarah's boat crew paddled hard toward the first buoy, fighting against waves that seemed determined to drive them back to shore. Every stroke required perfect timing and coordination, with all 6 crew members working in absolute synchrony. A single mistimed paddle stroke could send the boat sideways into a wave, resulting in a catastrophic flip that would soak everyone and require them to start the evolution over. "Paddle left, paddle left," Thompson shouted as a massive wave approached their starboard side. The crew responded instantly, digging their paddles deep into the water and pulling with everything they had. The boat skimmed up the face of the wave just as it was breaking, spray cascading over their heads and filling the boat with frigid seawater. Sarah's arms burned with exhaustion, but she maintained her paddle rhythm with mechanical precision. Around them, other boat crews were struggling with the same conditions. She could see one crew swimming after their overturned boat while instructors circled like sharks, screaming instructions and criticism. The return trip to shore was even more challenging, as following seas threatened to drive their boat into an uncontrolled surf ride that could end with them smashed against the beach. Sarah's crew managed to maintain control through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer luck, riding the waves in rather than being overwhelmed by them. "Not bad," Rodriguez admitted as they dragged their boat onto the sand. "You might actually survive until lunch." But lunch, when it finally came, was a cruel joke. After 36 hours of continuous training, the candidates were given exactly 12 minutes to eat, use the bathroom, and prepare for the next evolution. Sarah forced down a sandwich and sports drink, knowing that fuel would be critical for the challenges ahead. The afternoon brought log PT, an evolution that seemed designed by someone with an intimate understanding of human suffering. Each boat crew was assigned a 150-pound log that became their constant companion for 3 hours of exercises. They carried it over their heads, pressed it as a group, rolled it across their bodies, and performed countless repetitions of movements that had no purpose except to cause pain. Sarah's position at the end of the log meant she bore slightly less weight than the men in the middle, but the awkward grip required constant readjustment and put enormous strain on her forearms and wrists. Splinters worked their way into her hands despite her gloves, and the rough bark scraped against her neck and shoulders with every movement. "This log is your best friend," the instructor announced as they began a series of overhead presses. "It's heavier than any of you, stronger than any of you, and it doesn't care about your feelings or comfort. Learn to love it, because it's going to be with you for a very long time." By the time log PT ended, Sarah could barely feel her hands. Her grip strength was almost gone, her Her shoulders felt like they had been dislocated and relocated multiple times, and her neck was raw from constant contact with the rough wood. But around her, every other candidate looked equally destroyed. The evening brought another ocean swim, this one in full combat gear including boots, pants, and shirts. The added weight and drag made swimming exponentially more difficult, and several candidates began showing signs of serious distress in the water. Sarah found herself swimming next to Williams, a former Army Ranger who had joined the Navy specifically to attempt SEAL training. He was a strong swimmer under normal conditions, but the combination of exhaustion, cold water, and heavy clothing was overwhelming his abilities. "I got you," Sarah whispered as Williams began falling behind the group. She adjusted her stroke to stay next to him, occasionally providing support when waves or fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. It was a risky decision. Helping a struggling teammate could result in both of them falling behind and facing punishment. But the SEAL ethos demanded that operators never leave a teammate behind. By the time they reached shore, Williams had recovered enough to continue under his own power. He squeezed Sarah's shoulder in gratitude as they stumbled onto the beach, too exhausted for words but clearly appreciative of her assistance. "Outstanding teamwork," Rodriguez observed, having witnessed the entire evolution. "Martinez, you just demonstrated something important about what it means to be a SEAL." The comment was the first positive feedback Sarah had received from any instructor since arriving at BUD/S. Coming after 48 hours of continuous training and criticism, it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. But there was no time to savor the moment. The instructors were already setting up the next evolution, and Sarah could see in their expressions that the real challenges of Hell Week were just beginning. They had survived 2 days, but 3.5 days remained. As Class 347 prepared for another night of torture, Sarah caught sight of the brass bell gleaming in the floodlights that had been set up around the training area. In the past 48 hours, 3 more candidates had rung out, unable to continue the relentless pace and pressure. The bell seemed to be calling to her now, promising an end to pain and exhaustion and humiliation. All she had to do was walk over, ring it 3 times, and this nightmare would be over. She could return to the Marines, complete her enlistment, and pursue a normal life free from impossible expectations and crushing responsibility. But as Sarah stared at the bell, she thought about all the people who were counting on her success. The young women who dreamed of serving in special operations roles. The female Marines who had been told they weren't tough enough for combat assignments. The generations of women who had been denied opportunities because of their gender rather than their abilities. Friday morning of Hell Week arrived with the familiar sound of air horns and shouting instructors, but Sarah barely registered the noise. After 4 days and nights of continuous training with less than 3 hours of total sleep, her mind existed in a strange twilight state somewhere between consciousness and dreams. Only 14 candidates remained from the original 48 who had started Hell Week. The brass bell had called to 9 more victims during the night, their exhausted minds finally accepting that the price of becoming a SEAL was higher than they were willing to pay. Sarah stood in formation with the survivors, swaying slightly as her body fought to remain upright. Hallucinations flickered at the edges of her vision, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, sounds that had no source, glimpses of people who weren't there. She had been warned about this phase of Hell Week, when sleep deprivation began affecting basic cognitive functions. "Good morning, future SEALs," Instructor Rodriguez announced with his usual cheerful sadism. "You've made it to Friday, which means you're either tougher than I thought or too stupid to quit. Either way, we've got a full day of fun planned for you." Sarah tried to focus on his words, but they seemed to come from very far away. Everything felt distant and unreal, as if she were watching someone else's life through a thick fog. Only the constant physical discomfort kept her anchored to reality. The burning in her muscles, the rawness of salt-chapped skin, the bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement a conscious effort. "Your first evolution is a little team-building exercise we like to call Around the World," Rodriguez continued. "You'll carry your boats to the beach, paddle to the hotel, run around the Hotel del Coronado carrying your boats over your heads, paddle back to base, and finish with some surf torture to cool down. The Hotel del Coronado was a massive Victorian structure that served as a landmark for SEAL training. Running around it while carrying a 200-pound boat would add several miles to an already impossible day. But, by this point, impossible had become the new normal. Sarah's boat crew shuffled toward their assigned craft, moving with the mechanical precision of people operating on pure muscle memory. Peterson was still there, along with Thompson and Chun. Williams had rung out during Wednesday night's fun, a 12-hour evolution that combined swimming, running, boat carries, and log PT into a seamless nightmare of suffering. Rodriguez had made it through Thursday, but disappeared during the night, leaving behind only his wet gear and a note thanking his teammates for their support. Martinez, Peterson whispered as they lifted their boat. "You still with us?" Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what the question meant. She was physically present, her body still functioning, her hands still gripping the boat. But her mind felt disconnected from the proceedings, floating somewhere above the scene like a disinterested observer. The paddle to the hotel took place in a dreamlike state where time seemed to stretch and compress randomly. One moment they were launching through the surf, the next they were pulling their boat onto the beach near the hotel. Sarah couldn't remember the actual journey, only fragments of sensation, salt spray, burning arms, the rhythmic splash of paddles hitting water. Carrying the boat around the Hotel del Coronado was a test of coordination as much as strength. The building's perimeter was more than a mile, with sidewalks, stairs, and landscaping that made maneuvering a 200-pound boat extremely challenging. Tourists and hotel guests stopped to stare as the bedraggled SEAL candidates stumbled past, their faces blank with exhaustion. Keep it moving, Thompson chanted under his breath, providing a rhythm for their footsteps. He had emerged as the unofficial leader of their boat crew, his massive frame and unshakable determination serving as an anchor for the rest of them. Sarah focused on putting one foot in front of the other, letting Thompson's voice guide her movements. The weight of the boat seemed to increase with every step, but she had learned to compartmentalize the pain, to accept it as a constant companion rather than something to be fought or overcome. Halfway around the hotel, hallucinations began interfering with her vision more seriously. She saw her mother standing on the sidewalk, calling her name and urging her to stop this madness. She saw her old squad from Afghanistan, dressed in full combat gear and providing security for the boat crew. She saw the Marine instructors who had dismissed her from OCS, laughing and pointing at her struggle. "Stay with us, Sarah," Chin said quietly. He had noticed her stumbling and moved closer to provide support. "We're almost done." Chun was a soft-spoken candidate who had surprised everyone by surviving Hell Week's brutal attrition. He wasn't the strongest or fastest member of the class, but he possessed an inner toughness that seemed unbreakable. His calm presence had become a stabilizing influence on the entire boat crew. The return paddle to base was conducted in seas that had grown significantly rougher since morning. 6-foot swells pushed their boat around like a toy, requiring constant adjustment and careful timing to avoid being swamped. Sarah's paddle work had become automatic, her body responding to commands from some primitive part of her brain that still functioned when higher cognitive processes had shut down. Surf torture was the final evolution of the day, and possibly the cruelest. The remaining candidates were ordered into the frigid Pacific and told to link arms while lying in the surf zone. For the next hour, waves would crash over them continuously, filling their mouths and noses with salt water while slowly lowering their body temperature toward dangerous levels. Sarah found herself between Peterson and Thompson, their arms locked together as they faced the endless assault of the ocean. The waves came in sets, building from small rollers to massive breakers that could lift a person off the bottom and slam them back down with devastating force. Hypothermia set in quickly. First came the uncontrollable shivering, then the loss of fine motor control, then the dangerous drowsiness that could lead to unconsciousness in the water. Sarah fought to stay alert, knowing that losing awareness could mean drowning even in relatively shallow water. "Talk to me, people," Thompson commanded, his voice barely audible over the crash of waves. "Keep talking, keep moving, stay awake." But Conversation was nearly impossible, with salt water constantly filling their mouths. Instead, they communicated through squeezes of linked arms, small gestures that confirmed everyone was still conscious and functioning. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the instructors finally called an end to the evolution. The surviving candidates stumbled out of the surf like victims of a shipwreck, their movements uncoordinated and their speech slurred from cold and exhaustion. "Outstanding work," Rodriguez announced with apparent sincerity. "You've just completed the hardest day of Hell Week. If you can make it through tonight and tomorrow morning, you'll be SEALs." Sarah barely registered his words. She was focused on the simple task of remaining upright and conscious. Around her, the other survivors looked equally destroyed. They had reached the limits of human endurance and somehow found a way to push beyond those limits. The night brought a series of shorter evolutions designed to prevent sleep while testing different aspects of SEAL capabilities. Navigation exercises in the dark, boat raids against simulated enemy positions, long swims in full gear, and endless calisthenics that seemed to serve no purpose except to cause suffering. Sarah moved through these challenges like a sleepwalker, her body operating on autopilot while her mind drifted in and out of consciousness. She found herself thinking about her father, killed in the line of duty when she was just 16. She wondered what he would think of her current situation, whether he would be proud of her determination or concerned about her judgment. As Saturday morning approached, the pace of training actually increased rather than decreased. The instructors seemed determined to push the survivors to their absolute breaking point in the final hours before Hell Week officially ended. The last evolution was a beach run, just like their first day of BUD/S, but conducted after 130 hours of continuous training. Sarah's legs felt like lead weights, every step requiring conscious effort and determination. But around her, the 13 other survivors were moving with the same mechanical persistence. As they ran along the surf line in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed inside her. The woman who had started Hell Week 5 days earlier no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, tougher, and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. "Last mile," Peterson gasped beside her, his voice hoarse from 5 days of shouting and salt water. Sarah nodded, conserving energy for the final push. In the distance, she could see the lights of the Naval Special Warfare Center, marking the end of their journey through hell. They had survived the impossible, proven themselves capable of functioning when functioning seemed beyond human capability. As Class 347 crossed the finish line, they were met by a group of senior SEAL officers who had gathered to witness the completion of Hell Week. Among them, Sarah recognized Commander Thompson, who had first offered her this opportunity months earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Instructor Rodriguez announced, his voice filled with genuine respect, "you are no longer candidates. You are future SEALs who have proven yourselves worthy of that title." Sarah looked around at her surviving classmates, Peterson, Thompson, Chun, and 10 others who had refused to quit when quitting would have been the rational choice. They had forged a bond that transcended individual differences, a brotherhood earned through shared suffering and mutual dependence. The brass bell still stood nearby, polished and gleaming in the morning light. But it no longer held any power over her. She had heard its call countless times during the past 5 days, felt its promise of easy escape from pain and humiliation. But she had chosen a different path, one that led through suffering towards something greater than individual comfort. Commander Thompson approached as the group began to disperse for much-needed rest and medical evaluation. "Sarah," he said quietly, "how do you feel?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Her body was destroyed, her mind was barely functioning, and she faced months more training before she could truly call herself a SEAL. But beneath the exhaustion and pain, she felt something she had never experienced before: absolute confidence in her own capabilities. "Sir," she replied, "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Thompson smiled and shook her hand. "Congratulations, Petty Officer Martinez. You just became the first woman to successfully complete BUD/S Hell Week." As Sarah walked toward her quarters for the first real sleep she would get in nearly a week, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Expelled from Marine Officer Candidate School for reasons that had nothing to do with her abilities, she had been offered an opportunity that seemed impossible to achieve. Now, that impossible achievement was behind her. She was still months away from earning the trident that marked a fully qualified SEAL, but she had passed the ultimate test. She had proven that gender was irrelevant when measured against determination, toughness, and the will to succeed. More importantly, she had opened a door that had been closed for decades. Future generations of women would have opportunities she could only dream of because she had been willing to endure the impossible in pursuit of the unprecedented. As Sarah finally collapsed onto her bunk, she felt the satisfaction that comes from pushing beyond perceived limitations and discovering strength that had always been there, waiting to be revealed. She had survived Hell Week, but, more than that, she had proven herself worthy of wearing the SEAL Trident. The brass bell would continue to call to future candidates, offering them the easy way out when the training became unbearable. But Sarah Martinez had answered a different call, the call to excellence, to service, and to breaking barriers that others said could never be broken. She was well on her way to becoming something that had never existed before, a female Navy SEAL. "Martinez," Peterson called softly. "You okay?" Sarah turned away from the bell and picked up her equipment. "I'm good," she replied. "Let's see what's next." As they prepared for the third night of Hell Week, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected, a growing confidence in her ability to survive. The training was brutal, the expectations were impossible, and the physical demands were overwhelming. But she was still here, still functioning, still moving forward when everything inside her screamed for rest. Maybe, just maybe, she actually had what it took to become a Navy SEAL. "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "But if we can make it through today, maybe we can make it through tomorrow." As the instructors began calling for the next evolution, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that was becoming familiar. She had survived her first real test as a SEAL candidate, but it was clear that the challenges would only get harder from here. The path to becoming a female Navy SEAL stretched ahead of her like an impossible mountain to climb. But for the first time since arriving in Coronado, Sarah felt like she might actually have what it would take to reach the summit. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah felt the weight of the last 3 months falling away. The humiliation, the frustration, the constant battle against prejudice and bias, all of it was receding below her like a bad dream. But ahead lay something even more challenging. SEAL training was legendary for its brutality, its impossibly high standards, and its ability to break even the strongest candidates. She would be entering that crucible as not just another hopeful operator, but as a pioneer carrying the dreams of every woman who had ever been told she couldn't compete with men in combat roles. Williams leaned over to speak above the noise of the rotors. "Sarah, any second thoughts?" Sarah looked down at the shrinking Marine base below, then ahead toward the horizon where her new challenge waited. "Master Chief," she replied, "I've been having second thoughts for 3 months. Now I'm ready to find out what I'm really capable of." The Black Hawk banked toward the west, carrying Sarah Martinez toward the most difficult test of her life, and toward the possibility of becoming something that had never existed before, a female Navy SEAL. "Sarah, how would you feel about starting over? Different service, different mission, different standards?" "I'm not sure what you mean, Master Chief." "I mean," Williams said, glancing around at the Marine instructors who were watching from a respectful distance, "how would you feel about training to become a Navy SEAL?"